The ocean world of Selouin IV had never known war. For 12,000 years, the Velthari had lived beneath its glowing waters, building cities of coral and light, archiving the histories of 1,000 species, and serving as the galaxy's most trusted diplomats. They were gentle creatures, shaped like great cephalopods, with transparent skin that shimmered in blues and silvers. Their tentacles were made for delicate work, for writing, for healing, for reaching out in friendship. They had no claws, they had no weapons, they had never needed them. Elder Archivist Selene was the oldest living Velthari. She had spent 900 years collecting the stories of civilizations across the galaxy. She had brokered peace between empires and translated languages that no one else could speak. She had seen the rise and fall of dynasties from her chamber deep beneath the capital city of Velundra. She believed with every fiber of her ancient body that the universe rewarded those who chose peace over violence. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The Kavrathi came without warning. There was no declaration of war, no diplomatic channel opened, no ultimatum delivered. One moment, the skies above Selouin IV were calm and full of stars. The next moment, those stars disappeared, blotted out by a fleet so massive it cast a shadow across the entire northern hemisphere. The ships were not made of metal. They were alive, enormous organic structures that pulsed and breathed like monstrous deep-sea creatures. Their hulls were covered in thick, dark skin that healed itself when damaged. Their weapons were biological, firing superheated plasma from organs that grew along their spines. The Kavrathi did not build their fleet. They grew it, they fed it, and what they fed it was the biomass of entire worlds. The first strikes hit the coastal cities. Columns of green fire fell from orbit and turned the shallow seas to steam. Velundra's outer districts were gone in minutes. Billions of tiny bioluminescent structures that had taken centuries to grow were boiled away in seconds. The screams of the Velthari carried through the water, a sound so terrible that even the deep-sea creatures fled to the darkest trenches. Selene felt the vibrations from her chamber far below the surface. Her aide, a young archivist named Pale, rushed in with panic written across every color-shifting cell of his skin. "Elder, the surface cities are gone," Pale said, his voice shaking. "They are burning everything. We have received no communication from the attackers. They do not respond to any frequency." Selene closed her many eyes and felt the weight of 9 centuries pressing down on her. She had always believed that any conflict could be resolved through understanding. She had always believed that reason could reach even the most hostile mind. But the tremors shaking her world told her a different truth. Some things could not be reasoned with. Understood destruction. "Have we contacted the Galactic Concord?" she asked. "Yes, Elder. We have sent emergency signals to all member species. The Rinhari have offered humanitarian ships. The Torvan have expressed concern. 14 species have sent formal statements of solidarity. And how many have offered to fight?" Pale's skin went pale, which for a Velthari meant absolute despair. "None, Elder. The Kavrathi fleet numbers over 2,000 vessels. No single member species has the military strength to challenge them, and no coalition has been willing to commit forces." Selene moved slowly through her chamber, her tentacles brushing against the ancient archive walls that held the recorded histories of the galaxy. Somewhere in these records was the story of every war ever fought, every empire ever toppled, every species that had risen to power, and every one that had been ground to dust. She had read them all. She had memorized the patterns. Knew there was only one species in the entire galaxy that had ever made the Kavrathi's kind of power look small. She moved to the communication array at the center of her chamber. It was an old device, built into the foundations of Velundra itself, capable of broadcasting on every known frequency in the galaxy, including one frequency that no species had used in 40 years. Terran Military Band 0. Elder, Pale said, his voice barely a whisper now, you cannot be serious. I am completely serious. The humans have been in isolation for 4 decades. The Treaty of Quiet was signed specifically to keep them contained. The Concord is sending us statements of solidarity while our people burn. Solen's voice was harder than Pale had ever heard it. I do not need solidarity. I need someone who knows how to fight. But the humans, Elder, you know what they are. You know what they have done. The Crescent War, the silence of Thurak 9, are the most dangerous species the galaxy has ever. Yes? Solen placed her tentacle on the transmission control. That is exactly why I am calling them. She activated the beacon of last light. The signal erupted outward at faster than light speeds, crossing the galaxy in waves. It carried a simple message encoded in Galactic Standard and in Terran English, a language Solen had learned centuries ago, just in case. This is Elder Archivist Solen of the Veltari civilization on Selûan 4. We are under attack by an unknown hostile force. We are a peaceful species with no military capability. Our cities are burning and our people are dying. We are broadcasting on all frequencies, including Terran Military Band 0. To anyone who can hear this, we need help. Across the galaxy, species received the signal and understood immediately what Solen had done. The Rinhari ambassador dropped his diplomatic tablet and stared at his aide with wide, terrified eyes. She broadcast on Band 0, he said. She actually broadcast on Band 0. What does that mean? His young aide asked. The ambassador's face was grim. It means she did not just ask for help, she asked them for help. And when the humans come, and they will come, God help the Kavrathi, God help us all. 14,000 light-years away, deep inside the hollowed-out asteroid of Ceres in humanity's home system, a klaxon sounded in a room that had been silent for 40 years. Admiral Kira Vasquez stood from her desk. She was a tall woman with dark skin, silver hair cropped close to her skull, and eyes that had seen things she never talked about. She read the decoded signal twice. Then she picked up her communicator and spoke 2 words that would change the galaxy forever. Wake the Reapers. Across 12 hidden shipyards, buried in dead systems where no one ever looked, lights flickered on. Engines that had been cold for decades began to warm. Plating that had gathered dust for a generation hummed with renewed energy. Crews who had trained in secret for a war they hoped would never come received their orders and moved to their stations with calm, practiced efficiency. The galaxy had forgotten what humanity was. It had been comfortable in that forgetting. It had slept well knowing the humans were locked away behind their borders, quiet and contained. It had told itself that the Treaty of Quiet had solved the problem, that the most violent species in galactic history had been safely put to bed. But now someone was screaming, and humanity could hear it. In the silence of space, the Reaper fleet stirred to life. 300 warships built for one purpose and one purpose only: to answer the call when everything else had failed. They were coming, and nothing in the galaxy was going to stop them. The Galactic Concord Chamber on Rinhar Prime was the largest diplomatic hall ever constructed. It could hold representatives from over 300 species, and on this day, every single seat was filled. The air was thick with tension, with the smell of alien pheromones and the hum of translation devices working overtime. The emergency session had been called within hours of Elder Solen's distress signal. Every species had something to say about the Kavrathi attack on Selûan 4. Most of them said the same thing: how terrible it was, how concerned they were, how strongly they condemned the violence. And then they sat back down without offering a single ship or a single soldier. Ambassador Torek of the Rinhari stood at the central podium. His species were tall and thin, with gray skin and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on their elongated skulls. They were the galaxy's bureaucrats, the ones who kept the Concord running, and Torek had served in this chamber for 60 years. He had never been afraid to stand at this podium. Until today. Fellow delegates, he began, his voice steady, but his 4 eyes blinking rapidly, which anyone who knew the Rinhari would recognize as deep anxiety. I must inform this body of a development that many of you may have already heard through unofficial channels. The Veltari distress signal was broadcast on all frequencies, including Terran Military Band 0. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over each other in 100 different languages. Translation devices sparked and struggled to keep up. A Dreth representative, one of the tall, armored reptilians who sat in the back rows, actually stood and walked toward the exit before his aide pulled him back to his seat. Torek raised his hands for silence. It took several minutes to achieve it. Furthermore, he continued, our long-range sensor network has detected faster-than-light signatures consistent with Terran military vessels. They are moving toward the Saluan system. They will arrive within days. A Virani delegate, a small furry creature with enormous black eyes, spoke up in a trembling voice. How many ships? Torek looked down at his data tablet. Approximately 300. 300. The Virani sounded almost relieved. The Kavrathi have over 2,000. Surely 300 human ships cannot. Let me remind the delegate from Vor, Torek interrupted, and his voice was no longer calm, what 300 human ships are capable of. He activated the chamber's central display, and the history of humanity's wars filled the room in light and shadow. The Crescent War, 80 years ago, humanity's very first contact with alien life was an ambush. The Dreth hegemony, which had ruled its region of space for 12,000 years unchallenged, detected human radio signals and decided that this new species was too primitive to be a threat. They sent a strike fleet to Earth's solar system, expecting an easy conquest. They were wrong. The humans did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They did not even pause to grieve their dead. Instead, they did something that no species in galactic history had ever done before. They captured a damaged Dreth scout ship, tore it apart, and reverse-engineered its faster-than-light drive. While they were still being attacked, while their cities were still burning, within 18 months, humanity had FTL capability. Within 2 years, they had jumped behind Dreth lines. Within 3 years, the Dreth hegemony, an empire that had lasted 12 millennia, simply ceased to exist. The Concord chamber was silent as the display showed the aftermath. Entire Dreth fleet yards reduced to debris. Fortress worlds that had withstood sieges for centuries cracked open like eggs. A species that had considered itself invincible brought to its knees by creatures that had only discovered fire a few 100,000 years earlier. Came the silence of Thurak 9. The Thuraki were a slaver species. They had raided dozens of worlds for centuries, taking captives and selling them across the black markets of the galaxy. Most species tolerated this because the Thuraki were powerful and well-connected, and fighting them was considered too costly. Then the Thuraki made a mistake. They captured a human colony ship carrying 40,000 civilians, men, women, and children. What happened next was officially classified by the Galactic Concord. The records were sealed. The sensor data was encrypted and locked away in a vault that required the unanimous consent of all 300 member species to open. But everyone knew the broad truth. The humans found the Thuraki homeworld. They went there, and when they left, there was no homeworld anymore. Just an asteroid field where a planet used to be. The Concord did not punish humanity for this. They were too afraid to try. Instead, they negotiated. Treaty of Quiet, a diplomatic agreement in which humanity voluntarily withdrew all its fleets behind its own borders, sealed its space, and went silent. The galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief and spent the next 4 decades trying very hard to forget that humans existed. The display faded. Torek looked out at the assembled delegates. That is what is coming to the Saluan system, he said quietly. Not because we asked, not because they owe the Velthari anything, but because someone broadcast a distress call and the humans heard it. And that is what they do. Across the chamber, delegates began recalling their ambassadors and observation ships from the Selouan system, not because of the Kavrathi, but because they did not want to be anywhere near what was about to happen when humanity arrived. On Selouan 4, deep beneath the burning oceans, Elder Selene received the reports from the Concord session through a damaged communication relay. Her aide, Pale, stood beside her, his skin cycling through shades of gray and white, colors of fear. "Elder," he said softly, "the other species are fleeing the system. They are not coming to help. They are running from what you have summoned." "I know what I have summoned," Selene replied. "The records call them monsters. The Dreth say they are a plague. The Tharaki, what remains of the Tharaki, call them the end of all things." Selene turned her ancient eyes to her young aide. "The Dreth attacked them first. The Tharaki stole their children. Every species that has suffered at human hands struck the first blow. Tell me, Pale, if someone stole our children, what would you want me to do?" Pale had no answer. "I called for the only species in this galaxy that treats war not as a failure of diplomacy, but as a sacred responsibility." Selene's voice was firm and certain. "We are dying. Our cities are ash. Our people are screaming in the dark. I will not apologize for choosing to live. Will not apologize for calling the ones who will actually come." Above them, in orbit around Saloon 4, a Kavrathi sensor officer on one of the bioships noticed something strange on its instruments. A cluster of faster-than-light signatures had appeared at the very edge of the system. Hundreds of them, packed so tightly together that they almost looked like a single massive object. The officer ran a comparison against every known species in the Kavrathi Dominion's vast database of consumed civilizations. No match. The signatures did not correspond to any ship design the Kavrathi had ever encountered. The officer sent a query to the fleet's flagship, requesting identification protocols and tactical guidance. The response never came. Because at that exact moment, the first human torpedo, a weapon that traveled at 97% of light speed and carried enough antimatter to crack a small moon, punched through the flagship's hull from bow to stern. Massive bioships split apart like a rotten fruit, spilling organic matter and Kavrathi bodies into the vacuum of space. The Reapers had arrived, and they had not come to talk. The Veltari had seen alien ships before. They had welcomed elegant Rinhari cruisers with their sweeping silver hulls. They had marveled at Vorani scout vessels that looked like glass butterflies. They had even studied the ancient warships of the Dreth, massive armored beasts that moved through space like mechanical dragons. Every alien species built ships that reflected their nature, their art, their culture, their soul. The human ships reflected something else entirely. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Selouan system, and the Veltari observation sensors captured every detail of their arrival. 300 warships materialized from nothing, arranged not in any elegant formation, but in a loose predatory spread, like wolves circling wounded prey. The ships were ugly. There was no other word for them. They were angular, blunt, covered in thick plates of scarred armor that showed the marks of old battles never repaired. Their hulls were painted in flat matte black that absorbed light and gave nothing back. No decorations, no markings, no windows. Sensor arrays and weapon batteries jutted from their surfaces like the spines of some deep ocean creature that had evolved in total darkness. At the center of the formation sat the flagship, the Utek Erebus. 3 kilometers of armored menace that moved through space with the slow, deliberate confidence of something that knew it was the most dangerous thing in any room it entered. Its silhouette was broad and heavy, built like a battering ram with engines. The Velthari sensors could barely get a reading on it because its hull was coated in materials that ate radar signals and spat back nothing. Admiral Kira Vasquez stood on the Erebus command bridge, surrounded by her officers. The bridge was nothing like the spacious, well-lit command centers that alien species favored. It was cramped, dim, and functional. Every surface was covered in screens and controls, designed for precision and tactical awareness. Controls. There were no comfortable chairs, no scenic viewports, no aesthetic touches of any kind. It was a room built for one purpose: killing things efficiently. Vasquez studied the tactical display. The Kavrathi fleet was spread across the system in a loose net around Saloon 4, still bombarding the surface. Over 2,000 bioships ranging from small hunter-class vessels, the size of city blocks, to massive carrier organisms several kilometers long. The organic fleet pulsed with biological energy, constantly regenerating, constantly adapting. "Open a channel to the planet's surface," Vasquez ordered. Her communications officer complied. The channel crackled to life, the first human voice on galactic frequencies in 40 years. "Velthari, this is Admiral Kira Vasquez, United Terran Expeditionary Command. We received your signal. Hold on, we are here." Across the galaxy, every species monitoring the Saluan system heard that transmission. Concord monitoring stations, automated defense systems triggered and began warming up weapons, not aimed at the Kavrathi, but calibrated against Terran ship signatures. Old reflexes died hard. On Saluan 4, Elder Selene heard the message in her deep chamber, and felt something she had not felt since the bombing began: hope. The Kavrathi responded to the new arrivals the way they responded to everything. They attacked. The fleet split into assault groups and surged toward the human formation. 2,000 bioships against 300 human warships. The numbers were overwhelming. The Kavrathi had consumed civilizations with worse odds. They expected this battle to be no different. They were catastrophically wrong. The Battle of Seluan's Vale began the moment the first Kavrathi assault wave crossed into weapons range. And it became immediately clear that humanity did not fight like any species the Kavrathi had ever encountered. There were no warning shots, no escalation. There were no honor rituals or formation dances or any of the ceremonial nonsense that most galactic species engaged in before combat. The human fleet simply opened fire with everything it had, all at once. Kinetic kill vehicles, massive tungsten rods, accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, slammed into the leading Kavrathi ships, with enough force to punch through their organic hulls and exit the other side. The humans called these weapons hammers, and the name was accurate. Each impact sent shockwaves through the bioships that disrupted their regeneration cycles, killing them faster than they could heal. Plasma batteries and missile salvos followed in precisely timed waves, each volley targeting different biological systems. First the sensory organs, then the propulsion nodes, then the weapon glands. The humans were not just shooting, they were dissecting. The Kavrathi ships came apart piece by piece, each attack building on the damage of the last, in a pattern so precise it looked almost surgical. But the Kavrathi were not ordinary enemies. They were biological machines designed by millions of years of evolution to adapt to any threat. When the hammers proved devastating, the Kavrathi ships began growing denser armor plating. When the plasma batteries targeted their sensory organs, they shifted to alternative detection methods. When missile salvos disrupted their formations, they broke apart into smaller swarm clusters that were harder to hit. The Kavrathi adapted. They always adapted. It was the one thing that made them unstoppable. Admiral Vasquez watched the swarm clusters forming on her tactical display and smiled. She had wanted them to do exactly that. "Signal the Wraith squadrons," she said calmly. "Execute blackout protocol." Throughout the battle space, in the gaps between the swarm clusters where no one was looking, 47 human stealth destroyers decloaked simultaneously. Wraiths. Small, fast ships, coated in the same radar-eating material as the Erebus. They had been hiding in the battle zone since before the engagement began, running completely silent, waiting for this exact moment. Each wraith carried a single weapon, an antimatter charge powerful enough to turn a small asteroid into vapor. The wraith crews knew what blackout protocol meant. They had volunteered for it. Every single one of them. They had written their letters. They had said their goodbyes. They had made their peace. 47 stealth destroyers detonated their antimatter charges at point-blank range inside the Kavrathi swarm clusters. The explosions were blinding. Each one was a miniature sun that burned for a fraction of a second and consumed everything within a 100-kilometer radius. Kavrathi bioships by the hundreds were vaporized instantly. Not damaged, not crippled, but completely erased from existence, along with the wraith crews who had delivered them. Killing blow. The Kavrathi had no framework for this. They could adapt to new weapons. They could evolve counters to new tactics. But they could not understand a species that willingly chose death to achieve victory. In the Kavrathi biological programming, self-preservation was the foundation of all behavior. A creature that destroyed itself to destroy its enemy was not a warrior. It was a paradox. It was something that should not exist. And yet the humans did it without hesitation. The battle turned in that moment. The Kavrathi fleet, which had been confident and aggressive minutes before, was now shattered and confused. Nearly 1,000 of their ships were gone in the span of seconds. The survivors were disorganized, their hive-link communication network disrupted by the electromagnetic storms from the antimatter detonations. The remaining human ships pressed the advantage with ruthless efficiency. No mercy, no pause, no opportunity for the enemy to regroup. Grinding pressure, applied with mathematical precision, until the Kavrathi fleet broke and scattered. On the Concord observation feeds, alien diplomats watched in horrified silence. A young Rinhari analyst sat at her console, her 4 eyes wide, her hands trembling as she read the data scrolling across her screen. She turned to her supervisor and whispered the thing that everyone in the galaxy was thinking. They did not even send their best fleet. The Battle of Saloon's Vale was over. The Kavrathi had been driven back, their assault on Saloon 4 broken. For the first time in the Dominion's long history of consumption and conquest across 3 galaxies, they had been beaten. But deep in the organic core of the Kavrathi hive network, something was happening. The Hive Admiral, the oldest and most powerful Kavrathi organism, a creature the size of a space station, processed the battle data and reached a conclusion it had never reached before. Enough. For the first time in the collective memory of its species, the Hive Admiral activated a signal that had never been needed. A call that reached across the void between galaxies into the darkest regions of space, where light itself seemed afraid to go. A call for reinforcements. And in that darkness, something heard the call. Something vast, something ancient. Something that made the Kavrathi fleet look like a single drop of water compared to an ocean. The cargo bay of the Erebus was not built for ceremonies. It was a gray steel box designed for storing ammunition and spare parts. But on this day, the ammunition crates had been pushed aside, and 3,000 human soldiers stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, their heads bowed. Admiral Vasquez stood at the front. She held a data tablet with a list of names. 8,214 names. Crew members from 32 ships that had been destroyed. 47 Wraith teams who had given their lives in blackout protocol. Engineers who had been caught in decompression events. Medics who had bled out treating the wounded. She read every name. It took over an hour. No one moved. No one spoke. No one cried, at least not openly. When the last name had been spoken, Vasquez closed her eyes for one long breath and then said a single word. Remember. 3,000 voices answered as one. Always. And that was the memorial. Glory or sacrifice. No flags or anthems or grand words about duty. just names spoken aloud, so the dead would know they had not been forgotten. Then the soldiers filed out in silence and went back to work, because there was still a war to fight, and the dead would have wanted them to keep going. Elder Solène watched the ceremony through a remote feed from her chamber beneath the ocean. She had expected many things from the humans. She had expected brutality and cold efficiency. She had expected the arrogance of a species that knew it was the deadliest thing in the galaxy. She had not expected grief. She had not expected the way Admiral Vasquez's hand had trembled when she read certain names. She had not expected the way hardened soldiers wiped their eyes when they thought no one was looking. She had not expected the raw, unguarded sorrow of a species mourning its dead. The Veltari archives contained records of 1,000 wars fought by 100 different species. Records. Military funerals or performances. Displays of power meant to inspire the living and intimidate the enemy. What she had just witnessed was not a performance. It was pain. Solène made a decision. She would go to the Erebus herself. She would meet these humans face to face and understand what they truly were. The journey took several hours. A Veltari transport carried her from the deep ocean to orbit and then to the Erebus docking bay. When she came aboard, she was greeted by a young human officer who saluted crisply and offered to escort her through the ship. What Solène saw as she moved through the corridors of the Erebus changed everything she thought she knew about humanity. The first thing she noticed were the drawings. Children's drawings taped to bulkheads and corridor walls. Bright, messy, wonderful pictures of houses and pets and families, done in crayon and marker. Each one was labeled with a child's name and a message, "Come home safe, Daddy." One. "We love you, Mom," said another. "My hero," declared a third, next to a stick figure drawing of a woman in a military uniform. These warriors, these terrifying reapers who had torn apart a 2,000-ship alien fleet, carried pictures drawn by their children into battle. The second thing she noticed was the mess hall. She passed by during a meal shift and heard something she did not expect. Laughter. Human soldiers sat at long metal tables arguing loudly over card games, throwing food at each other, telling jokes that made their friends groan and their enemies at the next table howl with mock outrage. A young woman was doing an impression of Admiral Vasquez that had her entire table in tears, while nervously checking over her shoulder to make sure the real Vasquez was nowhere nearby. They were not machines. They were not monsters. They were people, loud, messy, ridiculous people who laughed too hard and loved too fiercely, and carried their children's artwork into the darkest places in the universe. The third thing she noticed almost broke her. She passed the medical bay and saw a human surgeon, a small man with tired eyes and blood on his scrubs, working frantically over a patient on an operating table. The patient was not human. It was Kavrathi, one of the enemy, a wounded creature captured during the battle. Its organic body was failing, its biological systems shutting down one by one, and this human doctor was fighting to save its life with everything he had. Solène stopped her escort. "Why is he doing that?" she asked. "That creature is the enemy. Its species is responsible for the deaths of thousands of his people." The escort, a young lieutenant who could not have been older than 25, looked at her with genuine confusion, as if the answer was so obvious he could not understand the question. "It is hurt, Elder, and he is a doctor. That is what doctors do." Solène requested a private meeting with Admiral Vasquez. She was granted one immediately. Vasquez's quarters were small and sparse. A bunk, a desk, a single photograph of two young boys pinned to the wall above her pillow. The Admiral sat across from Solène and waited. She did not fill the silence with empty pleasantries. She simply waited for Solène to speak. "I want to understand," Solène said at last. "I have read every record the galaxy has on your species. I have studied the Crescent War and the Silence of Thurak 9 and the Treaty of Quiet. I thought I understood what you were. I was wrong." Vasquez said nothing. So I will ask you the question that every species in this galaxy has wanted to ask for 80 years. Why did you come? You owe us nothing. You owe the galaxy nothing. It exiled you, it feared you, it locked you behind borders and pretended you did not exist. Why did you answer our call? Vasquez was quiet for a long time. She looked at the photograph of her sons. Then she looked back at Selene. Because someone was screaming and we could hear it, she said. That is it. That is all it has ever been. Selene felt something shift inside her. Something old and rigid that she had carried for 900 years. The belief that the universe could be understood through logic and archives and careful study. Cracked and fell away. What replaced it was something simpler and more powerful. The understanding that some truths could not be found in records. They had to be felt. But the moment of peace did not last. Vasquez received an urgent communication from UTEC intelligence while Selene was still in her quarters. The Admiral's face changed as she read it. Not to fear, but to something harder and more focused. What is it? Selene asked. Vasquez turned the display so Selene could see. The data was complex, but the conclusion was simple. The Kavrathi were not an empire. They were not a civilization. They were not even, in any meaningful sense, species. They were an immune response, biological antibodies produced by something much larger, something that lived in the void between galaxies, a superorganism so vast that it defied comprehension. The Kavrathi fleet that had attacked Selene 4 was the equivalent of a few white blood cells sent to investigate an irritation. The reinforcements that were now heading toward the Selene system were not a fleet. They were a full immune response, an extinction-level swarm containing millions of organisms, enough biomass to strip an entire galactic arm of life. How long? Selene asked. Days, maybe less. Vasquez composed the message to the Galactic Concord. She attached all the intelligence data, the analysis of the Kavrathi biology, the projections of the incoming swarm, the estimated timeline before it arrived. Then she added a personal note at the end. We can stop this, but we will need everyone. Humanity cannot be the galaxy's immune system. Not alone, not anymore. The time for treaties and isolation is over. If we do not stand together now, there will be nothing left to stand for. The message went out to every species in the Concord. For hours, there was silence. Selene sat in the Erebus Communication Center and watched the diplomatic channels with growing despair. She knew how the Concord worked. She knew the committees and the debates and the endless procedural delays. She expected weeks of discussion before any decision was reached. She was wrong again. The votes came in, one by one at first, and then in a flood. The Renhari voted yes. The Virani voted yes. Even the Dreth, the species humanity had once conquered, voted yes. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Concord, the vote was unanimous. Every species would stand with the humans. Vasquez received the news on her bridge. She allowed herself one small nod. Then she turned to her tactical display, where the incoming swarm was just beginning to appear. Very edge of sensor range. It was enormous. It blotted out the stars like a dark cloud spreading across the sky. She opened fleet-wide communications. All hands, this is Reaper Actual. What comes next is going to be ugly, and it is going to be beautiful. Hold the line. The combined fleet assembled in the Selene system over the next 72 hours, and it was the most extraordinary sight the galaxy had ever produced. Ships of every shape and size and origin gathered in orbit around Selene 4. Sleek Renhari cruisers with their silver hulls took position alongside heavy Dreth dreadnoughts covered in thick reptilian armor plating. Small Vorani scout ships darted between formations like silverfish, weaving through a coral reef. Torvan carriers deployed fighter wings that glittered like swarms of jeweled insects. Even the Kelmari, a reclusive species that had not left their home system in 1,000 years, sent 12 ancient warships that looked like flying cathedrals. Over 4,000 vessels from more than 60 species, all united under a single tactical command. For the first time in galactic history, alien crews accepted human officers into their command chains, and human navigators plotted courses for alien ships. Were enormous. The cultural differences were staggering. The mutual distrust built over decades of fear and isolation was almost overwhelming. But the swarm was coming, and fear of what was approaching proved stronger than fear of each other. Admiral Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Erebus and studied the tactical display. The swarm had entered the outer reaches of the system, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. It was not a fleet in any traditional sense. It was a living wall of organic matter, stretching across millions of kilometers. Billions of individual organisms, ranging from small fighter-sized parasites to massive carrier beasts the size of moons, all connected by a biological network that pulsed with a single unified intelligence. The combined fleet had 4,000 ships. The swarm had millions of organisms. It was not a battle they could win through firepower alone. They needed something else. Vasquez called a meeting of all fleet commanders in the Erebus war room. Alien admirals and captains crowded into the space, some towering over the humans, some barely reaching their waists, all of them looking to Vasquez for a plan. She gave them one. "We cannot outfight the swarm," she said directly. "We do not have the numbers, and we never will. But the swarm is a biological network. Every organism in it is connected to a central intelligence at its core. If we destroy that core, the network dies, and every organism in the swarm dies with it." She activated a holographic display showing the swarm's structure. The core was buried deep inside, a massive organic node surrounded by layer after layer of defensive organisms. Reaching it through conventional assault would be impossible. "So, we will not use a conventional assault," Vasquez continued. She brought up a new display, schematics for something that made every alien in the room go very quiet. "This is Project Prometheus." Project Prometheus was humanity's darkest secret. During their 40 years of isolation, while the galaxy assumed they were sleeping, the humans had been building a weapon, a directed gravitational collapse device capable of generating an artificial singularity, a black hole small enough to be contained in a torpedo casing, but powerful enough to consume everything within a 2,000-kilometer radius before collapsing in on itself. It was a doomsday weapon, built originally as humanity's last resort, in case the galaxy ever united against them. A weapon designed to make extinction mutual. Now, it would be used to save the very galaxy it was built to threaten. The plan was simple in concept and terrible in execution. The combined fleet would engage the swarm in a fighting retreat, drawing it into a concentrated corridor while protecting Saloon 4. Meanwhile, a single stealth ship would carry the Prometheus device into the heart of the swarm and detonate it at the core. The stealth ship was the Quiet Knight, destroyer crewed by 47 volunteers, commanded by Commander Don Okafor, a tall, quiet man with steady hands and calm, dark eyes, who had served on the Erebus for 15 years. Everyone in the room understood that the Quiet Knight would not be coming back. The Battle of the Dark Threshold began 6 hours later. The combined fleet met the swarm at the edge of the system, and the sky turned to chaos. Thousands of ships engaged millions of organisms in a battle so vast that it stretched across light minutes of space. Explosions bloomed like flowers made of fire. Alien ships and organic horrors tore each other apart in the darkness, and in the middle of that chaos, something extraordinary happened. Species that had been enemies for centuries fought side by side. Rinhari cruisers moved into defensive formations around Valthari evacuation transports, shielding the fragile civilian ships with their own hulls. Dreth dreadnoughts, descendants of the very species humanity had once conquered, flew in perfect formation with human destroyers covering their flanks and dying for each other, without hesitation. A Varani scout wing sacrificed itself to draw a swarm cluster away from a crippled Torvan carrier, buying time for its crew to evacuate. A Kelmari cathedral ship positioned itself between the swarm and a damaged human frigate, absorbing fire meant for the smaller vessel, until its ancient hull finally gave way. Its last transmission was a single phrase in the Kelmari language that roughly translated to, "It was an honor." The galaxy was fighting together. For the first time in its long fractured history, every species bled the same color, the color of sacrifice. But the swarm was relentless. For every organism destroyed, 10 more pushed forward. The combined fleet was being ground down, ship by ship, life by life. The fighting retreat was working. The swarm was funneling into the corridor, exactly as planned. But the cost was staggering. The Erebus Bridge. Vasquez watched the casualty numbers climb and kept her face stone. Still she gave orders. Her voice never wavered. Her hands never shook. Inside she was screaming, but her people needed her steady. So steady she remained. Deep inside the swarm, hidden beneath layers of electronic countermeasures and stealth coding, the quiet night crept toward the core. Commander Okafor sat in his command chair and watched the biological nightmare pass by his viewports. Massive organisms drifted past like living mountains, their surfaces covered in sensory tendrils that searched the darkness for intruders. The stealth systems held, but barely. Every alarm on the ship was silent, because Okafor had ordered them disabled. The crew moved in whispers, monitoring their instruments with the intensity of people who knew that a single mistake would mean not just their deaths, but the deaths of everyone they were trying to save. Hours passed. The quiet night penetrated deeper and deeper into the swarm. The biological matter grew thicker and denser, until the ship was essentially swimming through a living ocean of alien flesh. The hull creaked under the pressure. The crew did not speak. They barely breathed. And then they reached the core. It was enormous, a pulsing organic sphere several hundred kilometers across, covered in neural tissue that flickered with bioluminescent signals. This was the brain of the swarm, the seat of the intelligence that controlled billions of organisms across thousands of light years. It was ancient beyond comprehension, and it was alive in a way that went beyond biology. It was aware. Okafor looked at it through his viewport for a long moment. Then he opened a communication channel, not to the core, but to the fleet. One last message, sent on a frequency that would reach every ship in the system. "This is Commander Dan Okafor of the UTEC Quiet Night. We have reached the target. Prometheus is armed. Tell them we held the line." The trigger. For one fraction of a second, a point of absolute darkness appeared at the center of the swarm's core. A point where the laws of physics bent and broke and folded in on themselves. Then the singularity expanded. The core collapsed inward, consumed by a gravitational force so intense that light itself could not escape. A chain reaction tore through the biological network. Every neural connection, every organic relay, every living organism connected to the hive mind felt the core die and died with it. The swarm screamed, not in sound, but in electromagnetic agony, a death cry that rippled across 1,000 light years. And then silence. The swarm was dead. Billions of organisms went limp and dark, drifting through space like the carcass of some impossibly vast sea creature. The threat that had promised to consume an entire galactic arm was gone. Ended by 47 humans in a small black ship who had chosen to trade their lives for the lives of everyone. The aftermath was quiet in the way that only the end of great violence can be quiet. The combined fleet drifted among the debris. Damaged ships vented atmosphere into the void. Rescue shuttles moved between wrecks, pulling survivors from shattered hulls. The human fleet had been reduced to fewer than 80 operational ships from its original 300. Alien losses were proportionally similar. Thousands of ships from dozens of species had been destroyed. But the galaxy was alive. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Concord held a special session. Not an emergency meeting this time, but something that had never been done before. A session of gratitude. The Treaty of Quiet was formally repealed by unanimous vote. Humanity was invited to rejoin the galactic community, not as a threat to be contained or a weapon to be feared, but as a member to be welcomed. Elder Selen authored a new entry in the Velthari archive, the oldest and most respected historical record in the galaxy. The entry was titled simply On Humanity, and it was translated into every known language and distributed to every species. It read in part, "They are not the strongest species, nor the wisest, nor the oldest, but when the dark came, they were the ones who stood up. They came not for glory or conquest or payment. They came because someone was screaming, and they could not bear to look away. And when it mattered most, when the very stars were threatened, they taught the rest of us to stand with them. That is their gift. That is their terrible, beautiful gift. They remind us of what we could be if we were brave enough to try." Admiral Kira Vasquez returned to Ceres. She walked the memorial wall in the UTEC headquarters, the wall where the names of the fallen were inscribed. It was much longer now. Several new sections had been added to accommodate the dead from the Battle of the Dark Threshold. She found the newest section and traced her fingers along the letters, until she reached the last name on the list. Commander Don Okafor, UTEC, Quiet Night. She stood there for a long time. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply stood and remembered a quiet man with steady hands, who had held the line when it mattered most. Then she saluted, turned and walked home. Across the galaxy, on 100 different worlds, things began to change. Alien children, who had grown up hearing stories about the terrifying humans, the monsters in the dark, the destroyers of worlds, the species too dangerous to set free, now heard a different story. A true story, about a species that carried their children's drawings into battle, and mourned their enemies, and came when someone screamed for help. And on those 100 worlds, in schools and homes and gathering places, alien children learned a new word in Terran Standard, the language of the species that had saved them all. The word was together.